We welcome you to another Sunday School lesson. Sunday School is a gift from God. Habakuk saw nothing but violence and sin everywhere. From the misery of his heart, he called out to God to do something about it. God's response that he would use the Babylonians to chasten Israel disturbed the prophet even more, as if God told us that he would use a group of terrorists to inflict damage and bloodshed on our sinful nation. We would all probably ask, how could God use such a wicked people to come against us? At this point, Habakuk said that he would sit on his watchtower and wait for God's answer to his objections. When the Lord answered, he told the prophet to record the vision he was about to receive on tablets so that a messenger could deliver it. Although the prophecy Habakuk would receive could be easily understood, when it would take place was largely unknown. But the Lord also said that at the right time, the events of the prophecy will happen quickly. God was very aware of the sinfulness and lawlessness of the Chaldeans led by their evil kings, but he was still going to use them to discipline his people. But God would also judge the Chaldeans, as this lesson will show. Our lesson begins with verse 6, which says, "Will not all of them taunt him with ridicule and scorn, saying, Woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion." How long must this go on? When the Lord used the word him to refer to the Chaldeans, he was personifying, or giving that nation a personality. At a future time, the same nations that the Babylonians conquered will make fun of the defeated Babylonians. When the taunting takes place, these nations will be saying woe to him who increased their wealth by taking what was not theirs. Aha! What has become of them now? The use of the word woe in Scripture normally announces a coming judgment. What they took was not rightfully theirs. This small portion of the text is packed with some big implications, namely that the beginning of the work of restoration is when God's oppressed people tap into their own power to use their voices to speak to and against the injustices that they have witnessed. Verse 7 says, "Will not your creditors suddenly arise? Will they not wake up and make you tremble? Then you will become their prey." The Lord was saying that those whom Babylon had plundered would eventually do the same thing to them. The intent of this prophecy was to reassure Judah that their oppressors, the Babylonians, will not always have the upper hand. God reveals that those who gain their wealth by stealing and exhorting God's people would come to ruin at the hands of their creditors. Ultimately, those victims will awake or arise and make the Babylonians tremble when the plunderers will become the plundered. When this happens, the Lord said that it would be suddenly. Of course, the Lord was faithful to his word, for in 539 BC, Babylon was conquered by Persia on the night after King Belshazzar saw the hand of God writing on the wall at his drinking party. That truly was suddenly. Verse 8 says, "Because you have plundered many nations, the peoples who are left will plunder you. For you have shed human blood, you have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them." Habakuk continued his prophecy saying, "Because you have spoiled many nations, all the remnant of the people shall spoil you." The reason God would allow all the remnant of the people to do this to the Babylonians is clear, because of the violence, destruction, and bloodshed they had done to other nations. Verse 9 says, "Woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin." This second woe builds on the first one by emphasizing the Chaldeans' use of evil gain to fortify themselves in an attempt to become impregnable. The Babylonians' use of evil means to fortify themselves in an attempt to make their land unconquerable. They built elevated dwelling places, the much taunted hanging gardens that could not be reached by harm or destruction. The Babylonians were using their covetousness and ambition as an excuse for their own protection. But they were deceiving themselves to think that their stolen wealth would be a strong city and a high wall of protection for them. But the truth is, it's a sign of their own conceit. Verse 10 says, "You have plotted the ruin of any peoples, shaming your own house and forfeiting your life." In their pride, the Chaldeans sought counsel only from themselves. As a result, they brought shame to their own homes by cutting off many people from other nations. Since their basis of counsel or understanding was completely ungodly, their resulting actions were ungodly. This led to their cutting off many people and sinning against their soul, meaning they sinned against their own lives and forfeited them. Verse 11 says, "The stones of the wall will cry out, and the beams of the woodwork will echo it." The actions of the Chaldeans were so evil that inanimate objects are described as crying out against them. We understand that the stones and beams in the people's homes would not literally speak against them. It is highly likely that some of the materials used in building homes in Babylon had been taken from other nations. So the very presence of those materials testified against the people who had used them in their buildings. Each individual home was a representative of the nation as a whole. The Chaldean society was entirely evil, and the existence of the homes where the people lived would cry out against them. Verse 12 says, "Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice." Up to this point, Habakuk had addressed the greed and injustice of the Chaldeans as they took what belonged to others. Nations had been conquered and stripped of every item that might enrich the Babylonians and allow them to build their own luxurious homes and public buildings. Now the prophet added a description of the Chaldeans' violence. He declared woe to the violent despots who cruelly conquered other peoples and then made them labor as slaves to enhance their holdings. Verse 13 says, "Has not the Lord Almighty determined that the people's labor is only fuel for the fire, that the nations exhaust themselves for nothing?" No matter how much people might seem to get ahead by evil ways, God remains in control. What Habakuk said is going to happen is the result of the direct control of the Lord Almighty. The Lord All-Powerful has determined that a fire will destroy everything that the Babylonians worked to build. Everything the Babylonians had accomplished was going to become fuel for a great fire. Not only would the Chaldeans' works be destroyed by fire, the prophet also said that all their work will be for nothing. Our final verse says, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." There will come a day when all the enemies of Israel will have been dealt with by God and Israel's Messiah will reign on earth. At that time the entire world will know about Israel's God, as the waters cover the sea, and the Lord will be known by these judgments which he executes. The lesson for us is that those who refuse to be taught on the glory of the Lord, by his mouth or his word, will be made to acknowledge who he is by the judgments of his hand. Key verse. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice. Habakuk 2:12. God speaks directly of the violence and injustice of the conquering Chaldeans that Habakuk initially complained about. God declares that these efforts are ultimately futile, as the Lord Almighty will judge the oppressors and the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. This lesson serves as a reminder that injustice, violence, and oppression cannot win. The danger of greed for us today is just as great as it was for the Chaldeans. In the end, God's justice will take place and he alone will get the glory. Thought to remember. The Lord, the righteous judge, makes certain that justice prevails. Our lesson stressed two things in particular. First, we cannot get wealth through wrong means and expect it to last. Second, we are called to acknowledge that our God is indeed the one who should fill our lives with his glory. Our challenge is to turn from whatever wrongs we have done and turn to our God and recognize that he should be given his rightful place in our lives. He judges and punishes those who defy him with their corrupt lives, and we don't want to be a part of that. The truth is, there are consequences to injustices and God will see to that. Our lesson next week is entitled, An Argument Against Corruption. Our biblical reference is Micah 3:1, 3, 9, 12. We are truly glad you spent time to learn this week's lesson with us. We hope you are blessed and may share these with somebody else. We wish you can join us at the Cubao Church of Christ soon. Our congregation is a place to discover faith, find new friends, grow closer relationship with Christ and serve with each other's gifts. Thank you very much, have a great week, and God bless you always, dear brothers and sisters.